Hello folks and welcome to another Richard Head Longbows video. That bit of footage you were just looking at is some arrows and an arrow bag and other bits and pieces that we made for a recent commission for a museum. And Richard knows a bit more about that because he's been along there and it's quite an unusual museum. Where is it you've been and what is it you've been doing, Dad?
Well, I've been up to the big city, London,
Ah,
and to look at a replica ship, the Golden Hinde. There are actually two in the country. There's the Golden Hinde down in Brixham in Devon, but the Golden Hinde with an E on the end is currently in a dry dock in London, near London Bridge, and it was made as far as possible to be a faithful reproduction of the original ship. The original ship was sailed in 1577 and was Sir Francis Drake's ship and sailed around the world. So the ship there actually has sailed around the world. It was made to be an ocean-going ship, and it sailed around the world and sailed tens of thousands of miles, and is now in a dry dock near London Bridge, open to the public, or at least it will be open to the public. They're doing some alterations at the moment, getting it ready for the public. And the Worshipful Company of Fletchers, which is one of the City of London livery companies, which has been around since 1371. They were around a little bit before then, but they were joined with the Bowyers, but they had a falling out and decided to go their own way. So they were approached by the owners of the Golden Hinde if they could fund some arrows to go onto the ship in chests, a bit like the Mary Rose, I suppose, a chest with some arrows in and an arrow bag, a pouch, spare bowstring, bits and pieces for the public to have a look at. And they would have been items that would have been around in the Elizabethan era, although that was towards the end of the longbow as a weapon of war, really, because on the ship are a lot of cannon. And they are iron cannon. They're not fiberglass reproductions. And they were on there when this ship went off to sail around the world. I think it first went to America because some of the funding for the ship came from America. So I went up there, drove up there with a member of the Worshipful Company of Fletchers so we could hand over these arrows. Were originally to go by train, but decided we would go by car to save carrying all these nasty pointed things on the underground. As it happened, there was a tube strike on that day. So if we'd have arranged to go by train, we would have not been able to get there because there was no tubes, and the trouble was the traffic was horrendous, and it took us about 4 hours to get into the ship, but which we did. We had a look around. They're doing a lot of alterations. They've actually lowered the deck in one of the places because the head height was so low you had to bend down all the time. So for members of the public to enjoy looking around, they've actually lowered one of the decks to make it easier to do that. And they're hoping to let it out for corporate events to help fund the ship being there, actually. So they've had to do that. And they've produced some really nice wooden chests for the items to go into. They've already got a couple of chests with items in. One are these barber surgeon tools for making sure that life on board wasn't too horrendous if you had an accident or got injured. And there's another chest with a musket and bits and pieces in it. So it's very interesting. The ship is in this dry dock, and it's currently it's standing on its keel, but it's propped up with huge telegraph pole size pieces of timber to make sure it doesn't fall over. There's lots of scaffolding around it because they're doing a lot of work, and they're making sure that the hull is okay. Eventually they will move the ship so that they can get a visitor centre in and they think the only way they can do that is to raise the gate of the dry dock, which will have to be done by a crane on a ship, I think, float the Golden Hind up the dry dock a little bit, so they've got room to put in these visitor centre. So a long project. We met the manager of the ship when we were there, and also the owner of the ship. Someone does own it, so it's and he's prepared to do all this work. So it was a very interesting experience. If you look on the website of the Golden Hind, and don't forget it's Golden Hind with an E on the end, not to be confused with the one down in Brixham. If you look on the site, there's information about it, and if you want to visit it, which is well worth doing if you're in London, it's all the information is there. So fantastic thing, really. It's been built as authentically as they possibly could, including using the timbers that would have been available at the time. Had to use one or two alternatives, but generally they've tried to do that to make it very authentic. So having had our trip there, we didn't have any time for a nice lunch in London, unfortunately. We set back, and the traffic in London because of the tube strike was horrendous. It took us about 3 hours to travel 2 miles, and eventually it was 6 hours before we got out of London and got back to our home in Wiltshire. So all in all, it was very, very interesting and well worth a visit if you're up in London and like this sort of thing. And hope you like the pictures we've taken. Not so easy to take them inside the ship, so very confined space. But it was an enjoyable day, even though the traffic was horrendous on the way out of London.
Well, there we go, folks. I think it's probably worth planning your trip before you go, and not going when there's a tube strike, although obviously
exactly.
It doesn't look like we had an awful lot of choice. That was just the day that was picked. And as Richard said, I'll put the links to the actual museum, although as Richard said, that's not exactly been built yet, but they do have a website with all their details on of what they plan to do and what they've currently been doing, and presumably with dates of when they do hope to have it open to the public as such. And yeah, I've been contemplating also confusing you by putting links to the other Golden Hind just to just to send a few people to the wrong one for a laugh, but perhaps I won't do that. But be aware, as Richard says, there are two, which I was caught out when Richard mentioned it. I'd been looking at the wrong one when he mentioned it some time ago when we started work on the arrows and what have you. Anyway, we hope you enjoyed that, and yeah, we'll see you again soon for more interesting archery stuff.
One last thing, we were asked to produce the arrows because my wife Lindsay, who's part of the firm here, is an honorary liveryman of the worshipful company of Fletchers. So hence we were approached to produce the arrows for them.
There you go. There is a link. There was a point to this whole story.
Yeah.
There you go, folks. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you again soon.